It's wonderful to welcome Yardena Schwartz to the show. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yep.
Is a journalist and the author of a new book titled Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yardena, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. How are you?
Yes, I'm quite well, and thank you again for being on the show.
Of
I was
course, happy to be here.
I was introduced to you and your work by Jonathan Harunov. When I first met him, he was a journalist based in, I believe, in New York, but he's British, I believe. But now he's working with the UN. So, how do you guys know each other?
Well, I had long followed his work, and when he recently started to work on his own book, he asked me for some advice. So that's how we got to know each other a bit more.
I see. So tell me more about his own book to the extent that you can tell.
I don't know if I want to, because I don't know how much he's sharing publicly about it because it hasn't been published yet. But I guess I could say it has to do with Iran.
Okay. Well, we both look forward to his book, and hopefully, I can invite him again to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. You should.
Okay, so tell me about the book itself. So, why should people in 2025 know about this event that occurred in 1929?
So I think as we have seen over the last 16 months that many people around the world care very deeply about what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and care about the people there. And yet I think what's also been very clear is that many people know little about the context for what we're seeing today. And while many people discuss the context as very recent, the blockade in Gaza, ever since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, is sometimes the context we hear. Or, if people go further back, they talk about the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. But what is often left out of this very important conversation is the long history of this conflict that predated the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The 1948 is often discussed as if sort of just out of nowhere, Israel was created, and then there was a war in which about 700,000 Palestinians fled or were evicted from their land. But the war that led to that kind of climax of this conflict began long before 1948. And what I found over the course of my research of this book was that ground zero of this conflict was 1929 and this massacre in what was then British Mandate Palestine, what is now today Israel. And it really just explains so much of what we're seeing today in terms of how we got here and also how we can find our way out of this mess.
I see. So, of course, ever since October 7th started, I started to dive deeper into, the conflict and its history, and I've hosted quite a few conversations in regards to the ongoing situation as well as the history. And so I want to ask you, so when and how did you start to become interested in this ongoing conflict?
Well, before I became a freelance journalist based in Israel in 2013, so I was actually based in Israel as a freelance journalist for 10 years, reporting on Israel and the West Bank for dozens of publications. I wrote for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, The Economist, Newsweek, many different publications about what was happening there. And before I moved there and became a freelance journalist there, I had studied the conflict in university. And then as a grad student in journalism school at Columbia, I traveled to Israel and the West Bank to report from there. And I just have always been really fascinated by it. And so when I got the idea to write this book, I was living in Tel Aviv, and the reason I ended up writing this book was not because I decided to write a book about this massacre in 1929, but actually because a family in Memphis, Tennessee, discovered a box of letters in their attic. And those letters had been written in the 1920s by their late uncle, David Schoenberg, who had moved from Memphis to British Mandate Palestine to study at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the Holy Land. Yeshiva is a place of Jewish learning. So this young man, David, he was born to a Jewish family. His parents were poor immigrants from Ukraine. They had fled anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and they weren't very religious. They were traditional, not very religious, but he became really fascinated by his Jewish history and his heritage, became more and more religious, and decided to move to the ancient land of Israel, what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. And every week during his year living there, he wrote these beautiful, really descriptive letters of what life was like in the city of Hebron, which is where he was living and studying. Hebron is a lesser known city, compared to Jerusalem, say, but it's the second holiest city in Judaism. It's holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians because it's the burial place of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people. And, in Islam, he's revered as a prophet. And yeah, so this family didn't know that these letters were sitting in their attic, but they knew that their uncle David had moved to Hebron and that he had been killed in this massacre. And so when they spent about 10 years just kind of reading and going through his letters and organizing them, they realized that they were sitting on a treasure trove of history because so little is known about both the massacre itself and the state of Hebron. I mean, not the state, the conditions of Hebron before that massacre. Hebron, I knew about Hebron because I'd been living in Israel and reporting on it. And the Hebron I knew then was so different from the Hebron he described. In his letters, he described it as, the safest place for Jews in Palestine. He described it as a place where, the relations between the Muslims and Jews who were living there were really extraordinary. There were about 800 Jews living in Hebron at the time, amid about 20,000 Muslims, and they lived side by side. They owned businesses together. Many of the Jews rented their homes from Arab landlords. And, from what I had known about Hebron and, the time I had spent in Hebron, I had only been there one time before reading David's letters. It was the polar opposite of the Hebron he was describing in his letters. And that was partly what interested me so much about this story, was that, clearly this city had undergone this massive transformation between, his time in Hebron and our time. And I wanted to kind of piece together how that transformation had taken place and the massacre that decimated the Jewish population of this city, one of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world, really told that story, not only of Hebron's transformation, but about how this conflict had began, about how Zionism had been transformed over the years, partly because of, actually, in many ways, because of that massacre that ended David's life.
Mhm. I see. So, of course, we're in for a rather harrowing history lesson here. But I think for people who have read up on the conflict, that when people think of the phrase Hebron and massacre, they often think of the one that took place in 1994. That's where a rather radicalized Jewish man, Baruch Goldstein, opened fire
Mm-hmm.
on worshiping Muslims. I believe the location was the cave of the patriarchs where Abraham and Sarah were buried. And so that is
Exactly.
the one
Yeah.
where they remembered. But there was another massacre that happened in 1929. So I wonder, to what extent are there parallels between the one in 29 and the one in 94?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question. And my book goes into detail about the massacre of 1994 as well. And there are some parallels. I mean, when you speak to the populations in Hebron today, so there are about, again, around 800 Jews living in Hebron today. They all live on the Israeli side of Hebron, which is about 20% of the city. On the Palestinian side of Hebron, which is 80% of this really massive city. It's the biggest city in the West Bank, and about 250,000 Arabs live in Hebron. And if you speak to them about the massacre in Hebron, they will all, talk about the massacre of 1994. Yet when you ask Jews in Hebron about the massacre in Hebron, they'll talk about the massacre in 1929. They don't see the massacre of 1994 as a massacre. I mean, many of them see the perpetrator of that massacre in 1994 as a hero. If you go to the grave of Baruch Goldstein on the outskirts of Hebron in Kiryat Arba, there are stones on his gravestone, and that is a symbol of respect and reverence for the dead. That was actually what I saw the first time, and it was the only time I had been to Hebron before I started working on this book. I visited that grave and was horrified to see that this man was being glorified by Jews living in Hebron, and not only by Jews living in Hebron. And, when I started working on my book and interviewing Palestinians in Hebron, I learned that, kind of a similar dynamic is at play there as well. While many of the people I spoke to in Hebron had no idea about the massacre in 1929, if they were Arabs, they had never heard about it. Those who did know about it denied the facts of the massacre. They blamed it on the British. But when you speak to many Palestinians today about, modern day massacres of Jews or, attacks on Jews that happen all the time. I mean, right now we're kind of living in the shadows of the massacre of October 7th, which was supported by the vast majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But there are much smaller terrorist attacks committed against Jews on an almost daily basis, either in Israel or the West Bank. And those attacks have also vast, widespread support among the Palestinian population and Palestinian leadership. So, there are a lot of kind of parallels here between these two massacres, and also the role of religious extremists in perpetrating them. So the massacre in 1929 was the result of a campaign of religious disinformation that was really spearheaded by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, kind of the equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine, the most powerful, the most important Islamic leader in the land. And he had spread this propaganda around Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's the most important mosque in Palestine. It's located in Jerusalem. It was built on top of the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem. So this campaign that he led for the year prior to the massacre in Hebron and the riots in Palestine, of which that massacre was part, centered around this lie that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple. And then, that year-long campaign of propaganda really seeped into society and convinced many of the Muslims in Hebron that their Jewish neighbors were not actually their friends, that they were, part of this plot, and that plot extended not only to Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, but also to the Cave of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, which in Islam is considered a mosque. And so that was what you had in 1929, whereas in 1994, it was a religious Jewish extremist who carried out this horrific attack against Muslim worshippers inside that mosque, killing 29 men and teenage boys in the midst of prayer during Ramadan. In 1929, the massacre killed 67 unarmed men, women, and children. And, in 1929, it was this religious conflict already, because the people who carried out that massacre in Hebron, when they were killing their neighbors, they were shouting Allahu Akbar. They were shouting Allah is the greatest. And they were claiming to be acting in defense of Al-Aqsa Mosque and in defense of Islam. And Baruch Goldstein, when he carried out his attack in 1994, he well, we don't know what was going through his mind because he was killed by survivors of his attack. But those who glorify him now and defend what he did, they claim that he was acting in response to the terrorist attacks that had been carried out against Jews before his attack. So in 1994, the backdrop to his attack was this campaign of terrorist attacks that had followed the signing of the Oslo Accords between the Israeli and Palestinian leaders. And that campaign of terror attacks was actually led by Hamas. It ended up being carried out not only by Hamas, but by other groups like the armed wing of Fatah, the rival to Hamas, which is led by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas today. But yeah, it just shows that you really cannot discount the devastating role that religion plays in fueling this conflict on both sides.
Yes, and there's a lot to that answer, but I'd like to start or continue by asking about the name Palestine. So in 1929, in Hebron, it was still part of Palestine. Of course, now we sort of associate Palestine with the religious national movement that by Palestinian Arabs to restore their national homeland. So tell me about, well, the history of why there's a name such as Palestine and how it came to designate this region, before 1948.
So the name Palestine has a lot of political meaning today that it didn't always have. So in my book, the area we're talking about is the British Mandate of Palestine. The mandate to rule Palestine was given to the British by the League of Nations soon after World War I ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had ruled many lands in the Middle East, including Palestine, which was a province of the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years before the fall of the Ottoman Empire with the end of World War I. So under British rule, and actually under Ottoman rule as well, Jews and Arabs living in Palestine were all considered Palestinians. So when you said Palestine or Palestinians under the British mandate, you were often talking about you were talking about either Jews or Arabs. It wasn't the kind of identity that it has today with Arabs who are from that region. And it also wasn't, an independent state. So, under the Ottomans, it was a province of the Ottoman Empire. It was considered part of southern Syria. Under the British, it was just, a British territory. It wasn't a state. It was ruled by the British. And essentially throughout Palestine's history, it has always been ruled by foreign powers. The people of Palestine never had sovereignty or self-rule. And the name Palestine was actually given by one of those foreign rulers of the land. It was before it was renamed Palestine by the Roman Empire. It was the Kingdom of Judea or the land of Israel. And it was actually a punishment against a Jewish rebellion in the first century that led the Roman conquerors to rename the area Palestine as a way to punish the Israelites and the Jews of that land for their rebellion, because the Roman name is Palestine, and it was the Roman name for the Philistine enemies of the Israelites, in the biblical enemy of the Israelites, and that was a way to kind of sever this connection that Jews had with their land. I mean, the name Jew and the name Judaism comes from the land of Judea. And there's still a part of that land that is known as Judea and Samaria under British under British rule. The area that is now known as the West Bank was known as Judea and Samaria by its biblical name. And if you look at, in my research for this book, I relied quite heavily on newspaper articles from that time. And I found it really interesting to see that in places like the New York Times, the area now known as the West Bank was called Judea and Samaria, even by, foreign correspondence, because that was what it was known as. Only after Jordan conquered that area during the war in 1948 did it become known as the West Bank of the Jordan River. And that's how we know it today.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, when I first heard of the name the West Bank, I always found it pretty odd because it's on the east, so to speak, of the Israel nation.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's just, I find it so interesting how all of these names and all these areas have such long history that predates, the way we understand them today. And that's just one example.
and in regards to the rebellion in the first century, would that be the one that's led by Simon Bar Kokhba?
Exactly. It was the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Yeah.
Okay. Um, tell me more about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so actually, if you go to Rome and visit, the Ark of Titus or the Colosseum, you'll see memorial. Well, I guess for them, it's not a memorial; it's a celebration of the Roman conquering of Jerusalem, which took place in the first century. That was the destruction of the Second Temple. So the destruction of the first temple was by the Babylonian Empire, and that led to the Babylonian exile in which Jews who were living in the land of Judea were brought to what was then Babylon, what is today Iraq. That is how you have so many Jews today who were descendant from Jews who had lived in the Islamic world. So there was, until 1948, there was a massive community of Iraqi Jews, about 100,000 in Baghdad alone. But there were also Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews living in other parts of the Islamic world, whether it was um, Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, Syria. About 850,000 Jews either fled or were violently expelled from the Islamic world around the time that Israel was established. But this is where that Babylonian exile, some 2,000, 3,000 years ago, was the result of the Babylonian destruction of the first temple. And then when the Romans conquered and then destroyed the second temple in Jerusalem, they brought back thousands of Jews from this land of Judea and brought them to Rome. And many historians draw the creation of the Ashkenazi Jewish population, so the European Jewish population, emanated from that expulsion, or that, you could almost call it like a kidnapping of Jews from the land of Judea as punishment for their rebellion, to bringing them to the Roman Empire, where they then dispersed into other parts of the Roman Empire. So you can see that if you go to the Ark of Titus, you can see this kind of depiction of the menorah being taken from the Second Temple and carried, and slaves, Jewish slaves, being brought to Rome. And at the Colosseum, there's a description of how Jewish slaves were used to help build the Colosseum.
Yeah, you mentioned the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yeah, I remember reading that I believe in the year 2000, Prime Minister Sharon visited the area, and that triggered like a violent outrage from the Palestinian side. And what followed was the Intifada, right? The second one. The first one was in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, and you've mentioned the background of the mosque and how it sort of represent the center of religious conflict between the Jews and the Muslims. But I wonder
Mm-hmm.
whether the backlash to Zionism, which is this new political movement in the 19th century, contributed to um, the outrage of the Arabs that led to the massacre in 1929.
Absolutely. So about 12 years before this massacre in 1929 and the riots of August 1929, there was a very controversial statement or decision on behalf of the British, and this was in 1917. So before they took over Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, this statement was known as the Balfour Declaration, a declaration by the British foreign minister stating his and the British Empire's support for the Zionist cause and for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. Not to be confused with a Jewish state. There wasn't really talk of a Jewish state yet. The idea was to create a Jewish home in Palestine where Jews could be safe from the anti-Semitism that was raging in Europe at the time and from the pogroms that had already led thousands of Jews to arrive in Palestine. So in 1917, there were already many Jews who had lived in Palestine for generations, but also those who had more recently come from Europe fleeing these pogroms. And the declaration, the Balfour Declaration had come just after the British had also promised to support Arab desire for independence. So it wasn't yet a Palestinian effort to seek independence. That was not really a movement at the time of the Balfour Declaration. What the British had declared their support for was the creation of an independent Arab sphere where that would be led by King Faisal in Syria or by the leader in Transjordan at the time in Syria. So there was, different kind of pan-Arab movements for independence. It wasn't, these individual states that we saw arise later, whether it was in, Transjordan or Syria or, then Palestine. It was this kind of, much larger movement for independence between various Arab territories. And after the Balfour Declaration, many Arabs living in Palestine and elsewhere felt betrayed by the British because the British, when they defeated the Ottoman Empire, was partly with help from Arab fighters who had deflected from the Ottoman side to the British side because of that, statement of support for their rights of independence. And so one of those people who had abandoned his post in the Ottoman army and fought or helped recruit fighters for the British. He didn't actually fight, but one of them was Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, who I mentioned earlier, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was appointed by the British. So he had already kind of shown his support for the British over the Ottomans, and then he was appointed by the British as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem around 1920. And he was probably the most outspoken voice against Zionism at the time. And so it was interesting that the man who appointed him to his post was actually a Jewish Zionist. The first High Commissioner of Palestine was a man named Herbert Samuel, and he was celebrated by the Jewish population of Palestine when he was named to his post and when he arrived in Palestine. There were celebrations, but the Arab population was very skeptical of him and of British rule. And so his thinking was, and he was later, this decision of his was later kind of called one of the biggest mistakes of his career. But he decided to appoint the Haj Amin Husseini to his post as Grand Mufti, thinking that it would help win the support of the Muslim population for British rule because he was seen as this anti-Zionist voice, and also because he came from one of the two most powerful families in Palestine. The Nashashibi clan and the Husseini clan were very prominent. The Grand Mufti, or Haj Amin al-Husseini's own father, had been Grand Mufti. His half-brother had been Grand Mufti. Yet he didn't actually win the election he ran in for Grand Mufti. He placed last, but through a bunch of different, maneuvers, the High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, ended up picking him to fill the post. And he also became the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which was a religious body that the British created to oversee all of the Islamic holy sites and the Sharia courts. And so he not only was, the most important religious, spiritual leader for Muslims in Palestine, but he also oversaw all of the funds and all of these holy sites. And so, this campaign that he waged against the Jewish population, claiming that they sought to destroy Al-Aqsa, it was all the more powerful because of the position he had. And one of the results of that was that he worked to restrict Jewish access to the Western Wall, which was the holiest place where they were permitted to pray. Jews were forbidden from going to the Temple Mount, the site of the ancient temples, because that was where Al-Aqsa was. The closest site where they were permitted to pray was the Western Wall, which is to this day the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temples. Thousands of Jews pray there every day still, and today also thousands of Muslims pray at Al-Aqsa. But 1929 was the first time that we saw a conflict or a violent eruption of this conflict coalesce around Al-Aqsa. That had not been a rallying cry until then. And like you mentioned, in the year 2000, when a second intifada erupted, that intifada is also called the Al-Aqsa Intifada because it was sparked by this visit by the opposition leader in Israel, Ariel Sharon, to that site. And that kind of sparked these fears, these Muslim fears that continue to this day in Israel and Palestine around this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Mhm. Yes. I think this is not the centerpiece of the book, but I think that the British role in fostering the conflict between the Jewish and the Arab population, and now it's been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, should be looked at because, as you've mentioned, the symbol of British collaboration with the Jewish population is Lord Arthur Balfour and his declaration. But of course, the British also collaborated or sought collaboration of the Arabs. Of course, the most notable figure being Colonel T.E. Lawrence and that great movie, Lawrence of Arabia. So were they playing power politics in order to win the war against the Ottomans here, or is there like a, a hidden agenda in mind for them to just play both sides like this?
Yeah, I agree that the role of the British in kind of creating and fostering this conflict is so overlooked. And in my book, I go into great detail about how the British kind of played both sides based on their interests at the time. And one example of that is how in 1936, after the Mufti led a rebellion against the British, they actually abandoned the Balfour Declaration, completely just threw away this promise of a Jewish home in Palestine, which went against their own mandate to govern Palestine. I mean, written in to the League of Nations mandate for Britain to rule Palestine was this promise of creating a Jewish home. By the way, if you look at the language of that mandate, it stipulated very specifically that the establishment of this Jewish home would not limit in any way Arab rights in Palestine or the rights of other religions. And yet, the reason this promise so worried the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and other leaders like him and other Muslims in Palestine was that for 1,000 years under Muslim rule of Palestine, Jews had been second-class citizens. They paid special taxes. They, in many places, were subservient to the Muslim population. For example, in Hebron, Jews were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs. The burial place of Abraham, patriarch of the Jewish people, was off limits to Jews and Christians. Only Muslims were permitted to pray inside or to enter this space. So, in various ways, the Jews of Palestine were kind of second-class citizens and Muslims were first-class citizens. And once the British took over Palestine, they saw that this kind of dynamic that had ruled the area for nearly 1,000 years was now going to end. And that instilled a lot of fear on the part of Arabs in Palestine who suddenly saw that this population that was a minority, in 1929, Jews represented about 20% of the population of Palestine. It was a population in total of about 1 million people. And, they feared that suddenly this minority was going to be much stronger. And that fear was exacerbated by a very xenophobic campaign that the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders waged. That sounds very similar. If you look at the language, it's very similar to the language of many nationalist politicians today who claim that these immigrants are coming to take your jobs, they're coming to replace you. That was the very same language that he and other Arab leaders used to create this fear against the Zionist movement and against the Jewish native population of Palestine as well.
Mhm. Yes. So you mentioned David Schanberg. He was one of the many who left their homeland to move to this area, Palestine. He emigrated from the United States, so he left a somewhat comfortable position, but there were many who left because of undesirable conditions like persecution, say those of Eastern Europe. So, who are people like David Schanberg and the migrants? Who were they? What were they looking for when they entered this land, which either which was populated by either desert or swamp, and of course Arabs who did not want them there.
Yeah. So David wasn't like many of the other, you know, immigrants who came at the time because he wasn't really coming there with the intent of staying. He came to study at this yeshiva, which would last about 2 before he moved back to the States, perhaps to become a rabbi. Eventually, while he was living there, and you see this in his letters, he seems to start to want to stay. And he even tries to convince his family to move there as well. But because he was killed in this massacre, we'll never know really whether he would have stayed or whether he would have gone back, become a rabbi in the US or become a rabbi in Palestine. So, that was David's case. And his story was very similar to many of the other students who had come from either other parts of America, like New York or Philadelphia, or most of the students at the yeshiva were either natives of Palestine or they were from Eastern Europe. So this yeshiva that he was attending, it was actually the Palestinian branch of a Lithuanian yeshiva known as Slobodka Yeshiva. So it was one of the first European yeshivas that actually established a location in Palestine. Many others would follow as well because of anti-Semitism and the economic conditions in Europe as well. But that was kind of the case for the students, these European and American students in Hebron. But there was also a population of European immigrants living in Hebron that were had lived there since the 1800s. Many of them were from the Chabad movement or from different kind of sects of Orthodox Judaism. They were not Zionists. They were not part of this secular Zionist movement because the Zionist movement, today there's a very strong element of religious Zionism. But in 1929, most Zionists were very secular. Not all, there were some religious Zionists, but the vast majority of the Zionist movement were secular Europeans who simply understood that there was no future for Jews in Europe. They predicted what would end up happening to the Jewish people during the Holocaust, when 40% of world Jewry was exterminated. But at the time, they were already experiencing massive amounts of deadly pogroms and anti-Semitism that led them to decide that the Jews needed a different home, and that home would not be in Europe. And they decided, though, despite the fact that they weren't religious, they decided that the natural home for the Jewish people was the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. For them, it wasn't a religious thing, it was a historic movement because historically, the Jewish people had come from the land of Israel All of their traditions, all of their prayers, all of their holidays revolved around the land of Israel. And so it was only logical that this home would be in the ancient land of Israel. And at the time, it was a very sparsely populated piece of land. I mean, today, this same land is home to about 10 million people. At the time, in 1917, it was home to about 800,000 people. By 1929, it was 1 million people. But still, you can get the idea from comparing what it was then to what it was today. There was plenty of room for these two people to exist. And the idea wasn't to create this, Jewish state where only Jews would live. The idea was to create a place where, Jews would be able to live in peace, practice their religion freely, live without fear of pogroms. And what happened with the riots of 1929 was that many of the anti-Zionist Jews in Palestine, this was, when I say anti-Zionist Jews, it's not the anti-Zionist Jews of today. It was, religious Jews who kind of were suspicious of this secular movement. They saw the secular movement, this secular Zionist movement, as sort of a contamination of Judaism, because for them, this belief in the return to Zion, from which Zionism has its name, they believed that this could only be achieved through God's will and the arrival of the Messiah, and that any effort to create this mass, movement of world Jewry to the ancient land of Israel was kind of, a slap in the face of God. It was blasphemous. It was, taking into man's hands what should only be done by God. This was how they viewed it. And it wasn't just the religious Jews or, the religious Ashkenazi Jews who looked at the Zionist movement with skepticism, but also the Arabic-speaking Jews. So the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who had been living in Palestine for generations and, got along very well with their Arab neighbors. They dressed like their Arab neighbors, spoke the same language as them. They saw these, European immigrants with their very different values of, equality of the sexes and egalitarianism and pluralism. They were also very skeptical because their way of life was very patriarchal, very traditional, and it was a different kind of suspicion they had than the Arabs of Palestine did. But they also, they kind of many of the Arabic speaking Jews living in Hebron at the time had closer relationships with their Arab neighbors than their Ashkenazi neighbors because they had these just vastly different ways of life. Yet with their Arab neighbors, they had a very similar way of life. They were very religious. They were very traditional. Their wives covered themselves from head to toe, both the Jewish and Arab men, if, those Jews were from, originally from Islamic lands, that is. Whereas the Jews who had arrived from Europe in the previous, 100 to 200 years, they had, very different way of life. So the fact that the riots of 1929 hit Hebron and this very anti-Zionist Jewish community that had lived in peace with their Muslim neighbors for centuries, the fact that they paid the heaviest price during those riots in 1929 really just transformed the Zionist movement, because now that same population that had not embraced Zionism and the underground Jewish defense force, the Haganah, that was until then almost exclusively an Ashkenazi defense force, all of that changed after 1929. So you saw many of these traditional Jews and Arabic-speaking Jews becoming Zionists, becoming, more amenable to the Zionist movement, and also many of them ended up joining the Haganah. So not the religious ones, but the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. And I should mention that David Schoenberg himself was one of those anti-Zionist Jews. In his letters, I found it fascinating that he was, even before he moved to Palestine, yep, he knew he was going to move there, he would talk about that in one letter in the same breath as calling Zionism an anti-Jewish movement. So I was so confused by that when I was first reading his letters until I understood that this was a very common sort of belief that, you could, on the one hand, believe that that the land of Israel and what was then Palestine was the natural home of the Jewish people, and that Jews should live there, but that the movement for world Jewry to actually live there and make that their home should be left to God and not to this secular movement.
So the name of Amin al-Husseini was mentioned, and uh, I think you recognize him, and as we all do, that he is the founding father of Palestinian Arab nationalism. And that brings us to the rather uncomfortable fact that the Palestinian national movement itself is a reaction towards Zionism. It has been since its genesis, and I would imagine that it is still the same way today. Um, and I think that that's what we have to reckon with, that without Zionism, if Zionism has never arrived in Palestine, there wouldn't be a Palestinian national movement, or the movement would have taken a different turn. So, how would you reckon this with the fact that, perhaps the desires of the Palestinians in the Arabs in Palestine, or Palestinian Arabs, for a national homeland separate or independent from the Jews are in some ways legitimate?
Yeah, I mean it's a very valid point. It's a really important point. Before 1921, when it became clear that King Faisal in Syria was not going to establish this greater Syria. Until then, Hajj Amin al-Husseini had, and many other Arab leaders in Palestine had advocated for Palestine to be a part of that greater Syria. It wasn't going to be this independent state of Palestine. That changed after the defeat of King Faisal and the French um, occupation and the end of those kind of aspirations by Palestinian leaders, Palestinian Muslim leaders, of course. So I think that it still would have emerged in terms of maybe not a Palestinian nationalist movement, but the movement to rid Palestine of its Jews. I think that without the Zionist movement, Jews would have still been living in Palestine. I mean, they would have fled persecution in Europe and come to Palestine even without the Zionist movement. I mean, just because the British had ended the immigration quotas that the Ottoman Empire had placed to limit the Jewish to reduce the Jewish population under the Ottoman Empire. If those limitations hadn't existed, perhaps there would have already been a bigger Jewish population living in Palestine before the British took control of it. I think that even if this Palestinian nationalist movement hadn't emerged in a response to Zionism, we still would have seen this effort to kind of persecute the Jewish population, the Jewish minority in Palestine, because what happened during the Holocaust is a great example of that, because Hajj Amin al-Husseini ended up fleeing Palestine and allying himself and his cause with Adolf Hitler from 1941 to 1945. The Grand Mufti, the first leader of the Palestinian people, lived in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin and served as the Nazis' leading voice in the Arab world. He issued Nazi broadcasts in Arabic throughout the Muslim world. He recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. And to the point where after World War II ended, the Grand Mufti was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. He was wanted for Nazi war crimes because he had recruited so many Muslims to fight for the Nazis. And he had led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And in the beginning of World War One, sorry, not in the beginning of World War One, but in the beginning of the Holocaust, in his first meeting with Hitler, there's a very extensive German record of that meeting. It was 90 minutes long, and Hitler essentially gave the Mufti the go-ahead for the Mufti's request, which was that the Nazis would eventually eradicate the Jewish population in Palestine, and that Hitler would help prevent a Jewish homeland from being established there. He also asked Hitler to help create an independent Arab state in Palestine. Hitler, stopped short there. He said, we're not in the business of state building right now. We're focused on Europe. But once we conquer Europe, he promised that he would take care of the Jewish population, not only in Palestine, but everywhere in the Arab world. And Hitler ended up referring to Hajj Amin Husseini as an honorary Aryan because he had blue eyes, light skin. Hitler actually thought that he said that there must have been some Roman stock in his blood because he was an anti-Semite, so he couldn't believe that someone of the Semitic race could be this smart and cunning. He believed he must have some Aryan blood in him. So I think that's another element of, this, the Palestinian national cause that is also unknown, not just that it was a direct response to Zionism, but that, the first Palestinian leader was one of the most lavishly paid Nazi accomplices. He was paid around 55,000 German marks per month, which was double what the average German field marshal made in a whole year. So he was clearly very valuable to the Nazi regime. And yeah, that was one of the most surprising findings of my research for this book. There are entire books written about the Mufti's role during the Holocaust, but I go into some detail of that in my book, including the kinds of very religion-based broadcasts that he issued throughout the Arab world. So it wasn't just Nazi propaganda; it had this, Islamic flavor to it.
Okay. So, finally, I suppose after October 7th, 2023, I think this book of yours, Ghosts of a Holy War, should deserve an audience, since there are many parallels that can be found between 1929 and 2023. So I suppose without naming all of them, what do you find to be the significance of these parallels?
Well, I think the significance and the haunting parallels, the fact that despite them being almost 100 years apart, there are so many similarities, not just in, the disinformation and propaganda that led to them. There's a reason why October 7th was named the Al-Aqsa Flood by Hamas. That's one parallel. Another is how after both massacres, the atrocities were denied by their perpetrators and blamed on their Jewish victims. That was true in 1929, and it's true today. But one difference, and I demonstrate this in my book, was that in 1929, those denials and those lies were recognized by the international community and by the news industry, by journalists as lies and denials. And, in newspapers that reported on these denials and these lies, they were presented as lies. And I think today, as a journalist, I've been really horrified by the way in which so much propaganda and disinformation is being presented as fact. And I think that's why we have seen such a terrifying rise in anti-Semitism around the world. That anti-Semitism is being fueled by the spread of disinformation, by what we have always thought of as reliable sources. When people are seeing Hamas propaganda and Hezbollah propaganda being presented by the most trusted of news organizations, they're not going to see that as disinformation or propaganda. They're going to see it as truth. And I think that's one of the reasons why we should be really cognizant of these parallels and how we need to reverse this course of history that is only going to get worse if these patterns continue. When I started writing my book, it was 2019. I started writing this 4 years before October 7th. And when I was researching both the lead up, the atrocities during the massacre, and the aftermath of the massacre, I imagine that this could be kind of, a warning to the world of like what happens when we allow disinformation and propaganda to um, carry entire populations without any kind of pushback and without any effort to weaken or end that disinformation. And I thought that what happened in 1929 would never happen again. And the fact that it did on such a larger scale and that it has been justified by so many people just shows that the actual history of this conflict and the disinformation that has fueled it for nearly a century has just been ignored for so long. And we're only going to be committed to another century of massacres if we don't do something about that disinformation and that propaganda.
Yes. So, as a follow-up to that, how can we, as regular news consumers, separate fact from fiction in the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict?
What I would recommend is in making sure that you're looking at the reporting or the claims being made by both sides and not just by one side. So if you're, following Palestinian accounts on, Instagram or in news reports, wherever you get your news, I would look at the Israeli press. There's a very strong freedom of the press in Israel. It's not a place where you can't criticize the government. The Israeli press is probably more critical of its own government than the press in the U.S. is. And they're amazing English language sources of news from Israel. So one of them is the Times of Israel, and they have an incredibly amazing reporters, and you know that you can trust it because it's often very critical of the Israeli government and military. Yet it reports, I believe, very honestly and very factually on the conflict. And I think that I wish more people would look at places like the Times of Israel and not, just Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is probably one of the worst actors, I think, in the news industry on this conflict. It's funded and backed and headquartered in Qatar, which is a primary backer of Hamas. So it's essentially like a mouthpiece for Hamas and the Qataris. And if people are going to get their news from there, it's going to be extremely biased. And, I guess what's really frustrating for me is that until very recently, I perceived the New York Times and publications like that as being sources of, you know, much more neutral coverage. And I think we've seen in the last 16 months that I don't trust it as much. One really strong example of why many people have lost trust in places like the New York Times and CNN and other leading news organizations has been the way that they rush to kind of parrot anything that emerges from the Hamas run health ministry in Gaza. One example of that is this claim that 70% of the casualties in Gaza were women and children. That is factually incorrect. You can even look at the data on the UN's website, and that is not the case. It's also been found that about one half of the deaths in Gaza have been Hamas combatants or just combatants from other terrorist organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So a lot of the casualty figures we're getting are from Hamas, from the health ministry in Gaza, and that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at any information coming from Gaza. And the coverage early on in the war of this supposed Israeli airstrike that hit supposedly a hospital. We saw how right after Hamas and Palestinians in Gaza reported that 500 people had died in that supposed Israeli airstrike, that all of these news organizations were reporting that as if it was verified or as if it was fact, when Israel immediately claimed that it was a misfired rocket from Gaza fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad that had caused that explosion in the parking lot of this hospital. And in the end, it was proven true that, Israel's claim was in fact true. And yet, by the time these news organizations recognized that, it was too late because so many news consumers had just seen that initial story and probably to this day still believe it was an Israeli airstrike that killed 500 people when really it was a misfired rocket from a terrorist organization in Gaza. And the actual death toll was something like in the dozens, not 500 people.
Okay. I think that's where we can end on. Thank you very much, Yardena Schwartz, for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me.